Hi, everybody. My camera was providing me with a little problem today, so you've been seeing the results of that problem. But hopefully, I won't have any more problems tonight. I will be sharing for a few minutes. Please be patient. I will try not to take very long this time. Okay, that should do it for the present. For the rest, I'm going to rely on you to help me share this. So please do so. I'm going to really go and say hello. Hi, Dolores. Thank you for coming. Hi, Margot. Thank you. Hi, Bonnie. Thank you. And hello, Steve. It's nice to see you also on a Saturday night, on a Thanksgiving Saturday night, actually. I think people have a lot to do on this night. So, here I am. This one is on the climate emergency and the labor manifesto, and have a number of interesting articles on the climate emergency to go over. So, let me start with the first of these. Which is the article appeared in Common Dreams. Let me change my view here. You should be seeing the article right now. Name of it is Existential Threat to Civilization, planetary tipping points make climate bets too dangerous. Scientists warn. And this article was written by John Quealy, staff writer at Common Dreams. I'm going to give you the clean view now. Citing an existential threat to civilization, the existential threat to civilization is in quotes, a group of top climate scientists have put out a new paper warning that the latest evidence related to climate tipping points, when natural systems reach their breaking point and cascading feedback loops uh, uh, actually accelerate collapse, could mean such dynamics are more likely than was thought and could come sooner as well. In the paper, published as a commentary in the journal Nature on Wednesday, the group of researchers summarized the latest finding related to the threat of tipping points as part of an effort to identify knowledge gaps and suggest ways to fill them. And quote, we explore the effects of such large-scale changes, and the scientists explain, quote again, how quickly they might unfold and whether we still have any control over them, unquote. And quote, will reach 1.5 centimeters in 1 or 2 decades, and with 3 decades to decarbonize, it's clearly an emergency situation, unquote, said Owen Gaffney at the Stockholm Resilience Center. While the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, introduced the idea of tipping points 2 decades ago, the paper notes, it was long believed that what climatologists refer to as, quote, large-scale discontinuities, unquote, in the planet's natural system were, quote, considered likely only if global warming exceeded 5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels, unquote. According to the researchers, however, more recent information and data, including the most recent IPCC summary, suggests these frightening tipping points could be exceeded even between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius of warming, unquote. That means this century, possibly within just decades. Quote, I don't think people realize how little time we have left, unquote. Owen Gaffney, a global sustainability analyst at the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University, and a co-author of the paper, told National Geographic, quote, will reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. Sorry, I keep on saying centigrade. I should be saying Celsius. Quote, will reach 1.5 degrees Celsius in 1 or 2 decades, and with 3 decades to carbonize, it's clearly an emergency situation. Gaffney added, quote, without emergency action, our children are likely to inherit a dangerously destabilized planet, unquote. According to the paper, if current national pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are implemented, and that's a big if, they are likely to result in at least 3 degrees Celsius of global warming. This is despite the goal of the 2015 Paris Agreement to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Some economists, assuming that climate tipping points are a very low probability, even if they would be catastrophic, have suggested that 3 degrees Celsius warming is optimal from a cost-benefit perspective. However, if tipping points are looking more likely, then the optimal policy recommendation of simple cost-benefit climate economy models aligns with those of the recent IPCC report. In other words, warming must be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This requires an emergency response. I want to stop at this point to put in a little bit of a caveat, okay, to this. Usually, the cost benefit models which are used by people concerned with climate change use some form, okay, of currency to assess the costs of doing anything about the climate. However, the modern money theory perspective, which I share, puts a different lens on this. And the reason why it does is because as long as we can contain inflation, the cost, the dollar cost, the financial cost of doing something about climate change, of containing climate change, is not a relevant consideration because the government, as long as it is a monetary sovereign, and all nations can make themselves monetary sovereigns. Keep that in mind, please. So from a cost-benefit perspective, if you're computing it in financial terms, there are no costs for doing something about the climate, for ending the catastrophe. You do what you must do, and you do not worry about the financial cost. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no costs. They're simply non-financial. There may be resource costs in doing something about the climate, and those resource costs have to be assessed. So there is a cost benefit perspective that we have to consider, but it is a cost, it's a real cost and real benefit ratio that we have to assess if we're going to get into a modeling frame of mind about this. So, that particular suggestion that 3 degrees Celsius scale of warming is optimal from a cost benefit perspective may be completely off. It may be that um, it may easily be that a 1.5 degrees Celsius, okay, is optimal, or that a half a degree Celsius, okay, is optimal, or that really no warming, okay, is optimal. Okay, in other words, if we like the climate we had in pre-industrial times, and we want to go back to that, then from a financial point of view, it would cost nothing to go back to that. It may cost us some resources. In the short run, it probably would cost us some labor resources, okay, human resources, other kinds, okay, of real resources. But the financial resources it's going to cost us, okay, are not important so long as we can contain inflation, and so long as our spending on the climate emergency does not have other harmful effects that we have to contain. Yeah. But there is no strictly financial sustainability worry that we, as people who have ultimate control over our nations, have to be concerned about. So that's an MMT perspective on this. Of course, not all schools of economics, okay, would disagree there, but if you happen to be someone who favors MMT, then you have to recognize that from the MMT perspective, listen, ending the climate emergency is a matter of survival for us. So, whatever it takes from the financial point of view, the governments of the earth uh, have the power to create the necessary financial power to do the trick, to make it happen. Okay. So, going on with the article. Okay, but so among the key evidence that tipping points are underway, the paper highlights a litany of global hotspots where runaway warming could unleash or is already unleashing dangerous feedback loops. They include frequent droughts in the Amazon rainforest, Arctic sea ice reductions, slowdown in Atlantic Ocean currents, fires and pests in the northern boreal forest, large-scale coral reef die-offs, ice sheet loss in Greenland, permafrost thawing in eastern Russia, and accelerating melting in both the west and east Antarctic. And here's a map for everyone. Evidence that tipping points are underway is mounted in the past decade, and also domino effects have also been proposed. So, okay, this is a map that shows where the tipping points are. and that shows the connectivity through the ocean currents. Okay. And then at the bottom, it names the areas where the tipping points are. So this is a very, very handy reference to what is going on and where the danger points are across the world. And you'll notice just off the coast of Australia, the eastern coast of Australia, there are the coral reefs and the large-scale die-offs, okay, the coral reefs. The rainforests having a great effect, okay, on life as well. There are dangers in the mid-Atlantic that affect both the rainforests, the Antarctic, and that are affected by the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. So there are feedback effects here that we see as well. So that map is a real good thing to study. The source is Professor Tim Lenton from the University, okay, of Exeter, the lead author, okay, of the article. Okay, and here's a quote from Tim Lenton that was picked up by The Guardian. Quote, as a scientist, I just want to tell how it is. It is not trying to be alarmist, but trying to treat the whole climate change problem as a risk management problem. It is what I consider the common sense way. And the quote continues, this article is not meant to be a counsel of despair. If we want to avoid the worst of these bad climate tipping points, we need to activate some positive social and economic tipping points. Renewable energy, for example, towards what should ultimately be a happier, flourishing, and sustainable future for the generations to come. Citing campaigners around the world, including young people this year, kicked off global climate strikes. Tim Lenton acknowledges that these people understand what world leaders seem unwilling to accept or act upon. Quote, we might already have crossed the threshold for a cascade of interrelated tipping points. The simple version is the school kids are right. We are seeing potentially irreversible changes in the climate system underway or very close, unquote. In their paper, the scientists write that, quote, the consideration of tipping points helps to define that we're in a climate emergency and strengthens this year's chorus of calls for urgent climate action from school children to scientists, cities, and countries, unquote. Despite the frightening warnings and scale of the threat, the researchers are not trying to be doom and gloomers who say that nothing can be done. And then there's the quote that I just read to you. And then it goes on, but the paper makes clear that the climate emergency is here in very profound ways. Quote, in our view, the evidence from tipping points alone suggests that we are in a state of planetary emergency. Both the risk and urgency of the situation are acute, unquote, the paper states. The researchers even provide a mathematical risk equation. It's a simple enough equation. We define emergency, which is the term on the left, denoted by E, as the product of risk, okay, and urgency. So what is risk? Risk is defined by insurers as the probability of a happening which is multiplied by the damage that the happening, okay, is likely to do. So that's equal to R, which is the first term in the multiplication. Okay, urgency is defined in emergency situations as reaction time to an alert, but TOR, that's a little TOR in Greek. Okay, it's the Greek letter TOR. I'm not sure whether you say TOR or tau anymore. I used to know, but over the years I've kind of forgotten. Divided by the intervention time left to avoid a bad outcome, which is T. Thus, E equals R times U equals the probability times the damage times the time to an alert divided by the intervention time left, okay, to avoid a bad outcome. Seems like a reasonable equation to me. I would only wonder about whether we should be using a formula from the insurers. In other words, there are different interpretations, okay, of probability, but it seems to me this may have more to do with the likelihood of really devastating catastrophes occurring. And so maybe we should be multiplying the likelihood that times the damage and take that as the risk. And then I think the rest of the equation is fine. Anyway, the situation is an emergency. If both risk and urgency are high, I can certainly agree to that. If reaction time is longer than the intervention time left, which is TOR, over T greater than 1. We have lost control. So reading that again, if reaction time is longer than the intervention time left, then we have lost control. That's what was wrong with that sentence. It lacked the then. We may have lost control because our reaction time may be greater than the time left. We don't know at this point. The group of scientists also acknowledge that some in the scientific community believe their warnings exceed what the available evidence shows when it comes to the threat of tipping points or the timeline. Some scientists counter that the possibility of global tipping remains highly speculative. It is our position that given its huge impact and irreversible nature, any risk assessment must consider the evidence. However limited our understanding might still be, to err on the side of danger is not a responsible option. And I agree that that's not a responsible option. Okay? The responsibility option okay, is to err on the side of the risk of error. The higher the risk of error, the more important it is to assume that the likelihood of error is higher. If damaging tipping cascades can occur and a global tipping point cannot be ruled out, then this is an existential threat to civilization. No amount of economic cost benefit analysis is going to help us. We need to change our approach to the climate problem. The Guardian spoke to Professor Martin Siegert at Imperial College in London about the researcher's paper and whether or not its warning comes in too heavy. Quote, the new work is valuable, unquote, Siegert said, and quote again, they're being a little speculative, but maybe you need to be, unquote. In the end, the new paper's conclusion was twofold. More needs to be known about these crucial tipping points, and that only urgent action can stave off the urgent threat of an increasingly hotter world. Quote, we argue that the intervention time left to prevent tipping could already have shrunk towards zero, whereas the reaction time to achieve net zero emissions is 30 years at best. Hence, we might already have lost control of whether tipping happens. A saving grace is that the rate at which damage would accumulate from tipping, and hence the risk posed, could still be under our control to some extent, unquote. Now this, and quote again, the stability and resilience of our planet is in peril. International action, not just words, must reflect this, unquote. And of course, I have to agree, and I think that we should all agree. It is our planet at stake. There is enough evidence that we're in a runaway situation right now to act as quickly as we can, okay, to act on an emergency basis. I think to act on a World War II basis when our existence as a nation was threatened. But this is much worse because the existence of human life on the planet is actually threatened. So that's what we have. We have the climate emergency. We have an existential threat. So let's get to climate justice. Here's an article from Truthout. The climate justice movement is turning up the heat on Democrats. Why? Okay, on Democrats. Because if you're going to win, you have to get the Democrats on your side, one of the two major parties on your side first, and then go after the other major party, because that's the kind of system under which we live. So there's an article in Truthout. It was published. What was the date of this article? On November 29th. And it was written by Mike Ludwig. And it's part of the series from Truthout called Climate Disruption Dispatches. I'll clean up the copy so you can see it better. There's the photo again. The fossil fuel industry knows it's the world's largest source of total greenhouse gas emissions, and that wealthy countries must take decisive action to reduce those emissions to avoid catastrophic global warming by the end of the century. The industry also knows that green tech and renewable energy is only getting cheaper. The latest climate report released this week by the UN makes these facts alarmingly clear. The UN reports that emissions from the fossil fuel industry reached a record high in 2018 with no peak in sight. Every year of postponed peaking means deeper, faster cuts in emissions will be needed in the future. Change must come quickly. In response to these facts, the industry is pushing to establish infrastructure capable of sustaining oil and gas production for decades. Even if but even but if the developed nations turn away from fossil fuels for energy, for example, in the United States and across the world, the industry is hedging its bets on petrochemical and plastic plants fed by oil and fracked by gas. We can't have that, folks. It's too dangerous in this emergency situation. We have to put an end to hedging our bets. The article goes on. This brings us back to Cancer Alley, the petrochemical corridor along the Mississippi River in southern southern Louisiana, where 7 large new facilities have been approved since 2015, and 5 more are awaiting the go-ahead from the government, according to ProPublica. One of the proposed plants, a $9.4 billion plastics megaplex planned by the Taiwanese company Formosa in St. James Parish, could triple the level of toxic, cancer-causing air pollution in an area that's already inundated by industry. The plant is slated to be built just down the road from Sharon Lavinia's home, and she fears Formosa, as the company, would wipe her historic majority black community off the map, along with other Cancer Alley activists. She's protested the proposal at one public hearing after the next and organized marches to the state capital of the Baton Rouge. Opponents say it's a classic case of environmental racism, but Formosa enjoys plenty of support from local and state officials and has glided through the permitting process. So Lavinia took her case to Congress, and she said, people in St. James need help from our elected officials. She said this in testimony to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce last week. Quote, our people are sick and they are dying, unquote. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, hunger strikers with the Climate Direct Action Group, Extinction Rebellion, were camped out in the entrance of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office, demanding the Democratic leader meet with them to discuss the climate crisis. After they learned, that Nancy Pelosi would not be returning before Congress went on break last Thursday, they stormed inside her office in protest of the, quote, lip service, unquote, Democrats are paying to the climate crisis. 9 activists were arrested. Quote, every day the evidence piles up at your desk, but you have yet to pass even symbolic legislation recognizing the climate crisis as a national emergency. With all due respect, you have failed, unquote. That quote is from a letter uh, is from a letter by Extinction Rebellion written to Pelosi. With emissions rising and uh, uh, but, with emissions rising and progressives like Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez inspiring the young voters and activists with visions for a Green New Deal, Democrats are coming under mounting pressure to push for sweeping action on climate change. Simply reducing fossil fuel consumption is not enough. The next section is called Earth. Fossil fuel production must come to an end, and the industry must be held accountable for the environmental damage and public health problems it has caused. According to a recent letter from over 260 organizations to Pelosi and Representative Kathy Castor, who's the Democratic chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. The letter emphasizes that frontline communities like Sharon Lavinia's and so many others, where the fossil fuel industry's daily impacts on poor and marginalized people are magnified by the crisis, should not only be prioritized for investment in the transition from fossil fuels, their leadership and vision should be front and center in policy making. Mitch Jones, director of the Climate and Energy Program at Food, and Water Watch, said Congress has a massive opportunity to combat climate change while addressing decades of economic and environmental injustice in communities from Appalachia to the Gulf South and beyond. Quote, Congress can direct investment into these communities for the clean energy economy, manufacturing solar panels and wind turbines, unquote. Jones said the truth out. Quote, they can guarantee good family supporting jobs that we're going to need in perpetuity instead of condemning their residents to more public health problems and more environmental degradation and more dependence on an industry that we know has to go out of business in the next couple of decades, unquote. Thanks to decades of grassroots activism in the environmental justice movement and now the climate emergency, these types of ideas are finally seeping into policymaking, at least among some leading Democrats, along with other Democratic presidential hopefuls. Senators Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren promise uh, massive investments in the nation's most environmentally vulnerable communities. But I might add that the Bernie Sanders investments are far more massive than the Warren investments, which by comparison are just a trickle. Senator Cory Booker has introduced a sweeping bill to codify federal environmental justice programs and made the issue central to his campaign, but also is promising a trickle of investments compared to Sanders. And Senator Kamala Harris introduced some legislation to tackle environmental racism and give frontline communities a leadership role in building a Green New Deal. Most recently, 150 House Democrats signed onto a bill with the goal of the U.S. of transitioning the U.S. to 100% clean energy by 2050. Okay. The deadline climate scientists have given to avert the worst impacts of climate change. But as we know now, that deadline is far too optimistic. It's more like 2030, that we're looking at. In fact, it may be the deadline has already passed. According to a fact sheet, the legislation focuses on job creation, and improving conditions for, quote, low income, okay, and rural communities, okay, of color, tribal, and indigenous communities, the industrialized communities, and other communities disproportionately impacted by climate change, unquote. Such language may fire up the Democratic base, but passing the bill into law with President Trump in office is virtually impossible. That may be and probably is, but at the same time, we have to note that even if the Democrats are to get into power in 2021, that bill is not enough. We need to have a bill that's going to end this by 2030, and the bill they're talking about doesn't do that. Trump has repeatedly threatened to cancel a small federal grant program for environmental justice communities, and his rollbacks of pollution controls are a threat to human life. With a majority in the House, Democrats could send a powerful message by passing bold climate laws ahead of the 2020 election. However, so far they have failed to pass any significant climate legislation. Meanwhile, climate disruptions continue across the world, emissions continue to rise. It remains to be seen whether the government can act swiftly enough to transition away from fossil fuels, and whether vulnerable communities like St. James will be left behind. Now we get to air. You see, we're going to add earth, air, fire, and water. Air. Levels of heat trapping greenhouse gases in the world's atmosphere have reached a new record high, continuing a long term trend that dooms future generations to a future of rising temperatures, more frequent um, 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 uh, um, more frequent extreme weather, sea level rise, and other disruptions, according to a bulletin released this week by the World, the World Meteorological Association, the WMO. The global average concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increased from 405.5 parts per million to 407.8 parts per million in 2018, surpassing the average over the past decade. And I believe it was clocked in 2019 at 415 parts per million already. Quote, it is worth recalling that the last time the Earth experienced a comparable concentration of CO2 was 3 to 5 million years ago, unquote. The WMO Secretary General Petteri Talas said in a statement, quote again, back then the temperature was 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it is now. Sea level was 10 to 20 meters higher than it is now. Also, atmospheric concentrations of methane, okay, and nitrous oxide, two potent greenhouse gases, have also rapidly increased over the past decades. The Trump administration is currently relaxing rules requiring the oil and gas industry to limit the amount of methane that leaks from its equipment into the atmosphere. Insanity, right? With methane being something like 6 times more potent than CO2. I mean, he's a madman. Not just a madman, he's a murderous madman. And his targets are us. Concentrations of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere are different from emissions into it. Emissions are the main focus of the bleak UN report also released this week. Emissions of gases entering the atmosphere from a smokestack, for example, while concentrations are what remain in the atmosphere after, quote, complex interactions with the Earth and its oceans, which absorb some of the emissions. Of all the greenhouse gases, CO2 accounts for about 80% of the radiative forcing, quote unquote, which is the warming effect on climate caused by greenhouse gases that are lingering in the atmosphere. Since 1990, the radiative forcing has increased globally by 43%. CO2 can stay in the air for centuries and will unless we sequester it. The best place to sequester it in is the soil. Quote, there is no sign of a slowdown. Um, 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 no sign of a slowdown, let alone a decline in the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere, despite all the commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Agreement on Climate Change, unquote, Tallis said. Quote again, we need to translate the commitments into action and increase the level of ambition for the sake of the future of the welfare of mankind, unquote. Both the WMO and the UN reports were released ahead of the UN International Climate Summit, being held in Madrid next week. Water. Two explorers attempting to ski 1,000 miles from the frozen Arctic Sea have been slowed by thinning ice. The Guardian reported this week. Mike Horn of South Africa, and Borg Ausland of Norway are traveling across the Arctic ice on skis and pulling sleds of supplies. They set off from Alaska in August by boat and plan to be picked up by another boat at the end of the ice sheet closer to Greenland. The pair hopes to finish their trip next week before the rations run out. But there's cause for concern. Thanks to climate change, the ice they are traversing is thinner than usual, which makes it more prone to drifting and changing its position. This has slowed the explorers' progress, and with rations running out, their spokesman described the final effort as a mad dash. Rescue teams in Norway were making precautionary plans in case they must be rescued. Scientists are increasingly worried about the cryosphere, the frozen parts of the Earth that regulate its temperature, as well as the water levels elsewhere. In recent decades, global warming has led to the shrinking of ice sheets, glaciers, Arctic sea ice, and snow cover. This melting contributes to warmer ocean temperatures and surface warming in colder regions, further stabilizing the cryosphere and the weather systems of the Earth. Most recently, the WMO warned that melting glaciers and mountain ice threaten people who are living in regions of the world. The Earth's glaciers, snow, permafrost, and ice are the root source of drinking water for about half of the global population. But as the world warms, these freshwater supplies are becoming increasingly unpredictable. As ice and snow melts, more water rushes downhill, increasing the risk of flooding. Floods account for 1/3 of natural disasters in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, and climate disruption has put about 1 billion people at greater risk in that part of the world. And now, of course, we end with fire. Another wildfire in California forced the evacuation of more than 2,000 homes from the mountains outside Santa Barbara this week. Firefighters were able to contain 20% of the fire by Wednesday morning. Thanks to their efforts and some rain showers, it was possible for most of the evacuees to return home, according to local reports. The K Fire, as it was dubbed, burned more than 4,300 acres by Wednesday along some of the highest ridges in Santa Barbara County, lighting the night sky up with flames. Large wildfires in the western U.S. consume more than twice the area that they did 50 years ago, and the average wildfire season is 78 days longer, according to the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Lightning or an unintended campfire may spark a wildfire. About 80% are caused by people, but climate change plays a role in their spread. Warming temperatures cause earlier snowmelt and hotter, drier summers in California and across the West, contributing to larger and more frequent fires. Using data gathered by NASA satellites, scientists have confirmed an increased risk of fires and an increase in burning globally because the Earth is hotter and drier than it was 2 decades ago. Forest fires larger than 1,000 acres occur 5 times more frequently in the U.S. today than in 1970, and on average they burn 10 times the area compared to fires that were recorded decades ago. Last month, the Kincade Fire in Northern California forced hundreds of thousands of people from their homes. Recent wildfire seasons in California, and the 2017 season in particular, have been considered unprecedented in terms of intensity and damage to property. And at the last, reaching the tipping point. While scientists continue to debate how the cascading effects of climate change may play out, depending how quickly governments are able to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, it's clear that climate disruption continues all around. With the UN climate summit approaching, scientists are warning that climate stabilizing systems such as the cryosphere and the carbon absorbing Amazon rainforest are reaching, quote, tipping points, unquote. It is also clear that the most vulnerable among us are being hit first and hardest. Consider Sharon Lavinia's neighborhood in Cancer Alley, which is nestled behind the levee in the Mississippi River's floodplain. The Mississippi Basin saw record flooding earlier this year, forcing authorities in Louisiana to open spillways to divert water and prevent widespread flooding. Significant increases in climate related, but in climate related rainfall and flooding have been documented in the Midwest, and that affects everyone downstream. Meanwhile, the industry that dominates the global greenhouse gas emissions grows around Sharon Lavinia's home, threatening to dramatically increase the toxicity of the air she breathes. In her testimony before the House committee last week, she called for a moratorium on petrochemical development in St. James Parish that would stop existing industry from expanding and stop Formosa in its tracks. And she said, quote, "We have 7 districts in St. James, and they're putting all the industry in the 4th and 5th districts," unquote. She said, referring to districts where residents tend to be low income and black. Quote again, "So we need something to stop the industry from coming in," unquote. Also, Representative Nanette Diaz Barragan, a Democrat from a diverse California district where communities of color face pollution from the port of Los Angeles and the oil industry asked her about placing moratoriums on development in hard hit communities elsewhere. If Congress passed some legislation banning fossil fuel development near um, 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 already overburdened neighborhoods, it would deal a massive blow to an industry that often builds in lower income areas and communities of color perceived to have little political clout. Such legislation would also be unprecedented. The Democrats are currently debating a number of climate bills, ranging from the Green New Deal to a carbon tax and other market tweaks favored by centrists. And only the most progressive contain environmental justice provisions. Passing any of these bills through the GOP controlled Senate would be difficult, despite the dire warnings from scientists. For now, the fight is on the front lines. Quote, now we're going to fight Formosa and we intend to win, unquote. Sharon Lavinia said to lawmakers, quote again, right now they're trying to get their air permit. We're going to stop them. They're coming in here to finish killing us. We're already sick, unquote. So that's the climate crisis manufactured by the fossil fuel industry in St. James Parish. In the great state of Louisiana, where there is no climate justice as yet. So now we move to the third and the last article I'll cover tonight. I won't have time to deal with the Labor Party article tonight. I'll take that up though on Monday. Here's an article appeared in Truth Out entitled "Could California's Public Banks Finance a Statewide Green New Deal?" And here's a picture of some dollars on a hillside in California. How'd they do that? And the caption is California's Public Banking Act can pave the way for a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. I'm going to put this on clearly. Also, excuse me for a minute while I make sure I've done something I should have done when I started this. There we go. We go back now. And so, after years of claiming to be a leader in climate action, California might be finally starting to step into its promised role, and it's bringing a secret weapon to the fight. And what is that secret weapon? Well, okay, the state is placing a moratorium on new permits for oil drilling activities that involve steam injection and fracking. That news came just a few months after the news broke that not only did California's top oil regulators have a vested interest in major oil companies, but since Gavin Newsom became governor, the number of oil permits had doubled. But here's a reaction to his latest move. Quote, Governor Newsom has shown the world today that the future of climate leadership means saying no, quote unquote, to the fossil fuel industry's dreams of endless expansion, unquote, said Stephen Kretzmann, head of Oil Change International, one of the organizations behind the Keep It in the Ground movement. And quote again, while there is still a long road ahead, the measures announced today are important steps towards comprehensive action to phase out California's oil and gas production and align its economy with climate safety. Unquote. Okay, Governor Newsom agrees there's a long road ahead. In his press release, he explicitly mentioned that the moratorium was undertaken with California's goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2045. Again, too long in mind, and the subsequent need to manage the decline of oil production and consumption in the state, all while ensuring that the transition protects California's people, environment, and economy. As in many climate discussions, the promises of balancing economic goals with the winding down of fossil fuel production and the ramping up of new infrastructure are often received with skepticism and raised eyebrows. Soon, climate action numbers in the scale of trillions are thrown into the debate. Excuse me one second. Are thrown into the debate in an attempt to align climate ambition with achievable solutions. But fortunately, California can bypass this misguided set of choices. Enter the state's secret weapon, public banks. Largely unnoticed in the environmental sphere, Newsom also made headlines last month when he passed the Public Banking Act. The act, the first of its kind in the country, has legalized the creation of public banks across the states, cities, and counties. Public banks, financial institutions that are owned and accountable to their people um, through uh, uh, their representative government, are often praised for their investments in much needed products and businesses in their localities. Supported projects typically include affordable housing initiatives and small business development. Now, I'm not sure how they can know what they typically include because for many years the only public bank in the United States has been the Bank, okay, of North Dakota. That's what typically goes on, okay, in North Dakota. What's going to go on in California might be entirely different and might be much more ambitious and even better, but that's another story. Just as they can provide support to local initiatives that are often considered too risky or not profitable by their commercial counterparts, public banks have the potential to close the energy transition investment gap by financing the series of projects and programs needed to wind down California's fossil fuel production. In particular, public banks can be created throughout the state with the explicit mandate of building green and resilient infrastructure, supporting communities' economic diversification, and encouraging education and training programs that can create a local 21st century workforce. They can do all of that, excuse me, while ensuring that the transition is done equitably and also democratically. Unlike commercial banks, public banks are guided for and by public purposes instead of the profit demands of shareholders. The end result is that public banks have more flexibility in providing services at lower interest rates and longer time frames. Furthermore, because of their public nature, they can and should be purposefully designed to promote accountability, transparency, and participation through such features as open meetings, multi stakeholder boards, and public assemblies that would keep them in step with the needs of community residents. Add these to the potential of public banks as depository institutions to leverage up to 10 times their capital, and it's clear how they can play a unique role in financing the just transition in the form of cheaper, renewable, and resilience projects, lower energy rates, and reduced energy poverty, while ensuring low income residents, often left aside in renewable and resilience projects, have access to the benefits. Now, I have a question about the leverage up to 10 times their capital. I skimmed over the law today in preparation for this stream. I didn't see anything mentioned about 10 times their capital. Uh, okay, I may have missed that in the law. But if California were to allow the public banks to become part of the Federal Reserve System, then they would be limited to 10 times by their capital. In fact, they wouldn't be limited in making loans, okay, at all, except by the there's technically there technically is a requirement to have a certain percentage of loans, or to have loans backed by a certain percentage of the reserves of a bank. I think the current percentage, okay, or proportion for banks that are part of the Federal Reserve System is something like 3%, okay, of the reserves that they have. However, this is not actually a limitation. The banks that are part of the Federal Reserve System can lend at the point of lending without any limitation that's placed on them through the reserve um, 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 through that particular requirement. Specifically, once the loan is made, the bank involved has a particular has a particular amount of time to ensure after the fact that they have met the actual requirement. And to meet that requirement, they can go into the federal funds market and they can borrow the reserves that are necessary for a limited time. And they can keep on borrowing the reserves that are necessary. So there isn't actually an operational constraint that in these times are placed on what banks can fund, but through that particular requirement. So it's perfectly possible to leverage up to far more than the reserve than that particular requirement, okay, in reserves, whether that requirement is 10% right now, okay, or 3%. I don't actually recall. I think it had fallen to 3%, but that's not actually a requirement, okay, that affects anything. We see this if we go to Canada and we look at their federal system. Okay, and you can see that years ago they wiped out any reserve, any requirement to have any reserves at all. Because what happens is when a bank runs short, okay, of any reserves, those reserves are supplied by the central bank in order to keep stability in the system. So the banks are not really dependent on the loanable funds market. They're not actually dependent on the federal funds market either, because if the federal funds market is frozen up and doesn't have any reserves that are available in it, then the banks involved can go to the discount window of the Federal Reserve and can borrow reserves from there. And because the Federal Reserve is tasked with maintaining the stability of the banking system, it pretty much has to lend the reserves to bring the bank into compliance with requirements in order to stop the bank from folding. So the Federal Reserve is forced to supply the funds, okay, the reserve funds. The real issue is whether the banks involved are making loans to credit-worthy customers or not. If they are, then it should be possible for any bank, okay, to leverage up as much as it cares to fund the public purpose projects that it's trying to fund. So let's go on with the article then. Let's finish it up. California has the unique opportunity to be the first state to materialize the ambitions put forward in Green New Deal proposals by combining its efforts to decrease its fossil fuel production with the creation of a network of public banks that can support decarbonization activities. California can finally make a U-turn from its dominant fossil fuel producer status and step up to the climate leadership role it has always wanted to play. And so that, of course, is wonderful news for California. It's perfectly practical, but what we should also keep in mind is that this should be supplementary to the federal role in the climate change transition and to the federal role in funding that particular transition. It would be very good if all the states had the capacity of California to fund the transition through a public banking network. That we have to remember those are loan funds, don't include any grant funds. Grant funds are very important in helping with the transition. Okay, well, as well, it can't all be done with loans, especially since at various times the Federal Reserve may want to raise loan interest rates. Okay, and also because from a business standpoint, a grant can be a lot more valuable than a loan in getting the kinds of businesses going that we need to have going for the public purpose, not just in California, but in every state. On the other hand, once the transition to get off of fossil fuel first starts um, 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 in earnest, then if there's a national change in the party that is running the transition, and if one of the new parties decides to slow down the transition, it would be great to have a network of states um, 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 and their banks that during the time when the federal government is slow at funding the transition can pick up the slack through its network, of state banks, of public banks um, um, in the states, which could then actually give the necessary loan funds to those businesses that are making the transition. Okay, so now I would like to turn towards your comments, questions, but before I do, let me remind you to please share, like, and subscribe when the YouTube goes up, which will be in a few minutes. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. Thank you very much for that. I hope you'll stop by there occasionally, because just like all the other live streamers, if I'm going to be doing this on a continuing basis, then I also need to make at least a small living out of it. So thank you very much. And I rely on you for that. So here we go. Let me come back to your comments, which I'll consider in detail. If they are in detail, thank you for sharing. Steve has shared. Jeff Ginter, I see, is here. Susan Eldridge is here. And Mad Hildebrandt is here. Hi, Mad. Nice to see you. Russ Garman is here. Hi, Russ. Great to see you as always. Greg Mallard is here. And Lana Dell has joined. Hi, Lana. And Steve Wolfbrand says the permafrost is melting. Yes, it is. Okay. And Elizabeth Netherland has joined. Hi, Liz. Russ says, I'm late to the party, but good evening. Good evening, Russ. And Liz says, wake up. And she puts in a link to YouTube link. She says, wake up. And that YouTube link is to Geoengineering Watch. Shasta County Supervisor is going to do some geoengineering. Well, I don't have time to consider it here, but certainly take a look at that. It looks like a very interesting video. I'm not sure about geoengineering is the best way to go about this. Oh yeah, geoengineering dangers discussed by officials, agency scientists, and other experts. Yes, I'm also a little skeptical, of geoengineering. However, my mind is open, but it's also open to dangers and risks, okay, from geoengineering. So there it goes. So thank you for the link. Okay, thank you very much for the link, Liz. And Donna Quinton has joined, and Liz has another link for us. Okay, I don't know if it's the same link, okay, or a second link, but whatever. News, okay, of geoengineering is very important to follow, so thank you, Liz. And Dawn Lorraine McGraw, hope that I'm saying that right, has joined. And Steve Gonzo has joined, and Jim Rushford has joined, Rosemary Robertson has joined, Matt Jokum has joined, Marco Shepard. I'll have to catch the rest later. Grandparent duties call! Night, everyone. Grandparent duties are very important, as I know myself. And Lana says, I just saw a short write up that Nancy Pelosi is taking some other Dems to a climate summit, I think in Spain. Not sure who are the others. She's taking probably a bunch of centrists in order to get them onto a boondoggle. Lana said, I thought North Dakota was the first state public bank. Yes, it has been, and I think for years and years it's been the only public bank in the United States. The State Bank, okay, of North Dakota, or the Bank of North Dakota, as it's called there. Russ says, got a call tonight. See you again soon. Thanks for coming, Russ. Lana says, I can tell from being in the lending business for decades that what is considered creditworthy is a moving target. I know, I know. But of course, I think the public banks can have some control over that. They can have some control over that. And because would be interested in the public purpose, okay, in making loans, their ideas about what, okay, is creditworthy, okay, from the standpoint of serving a public purpose could be far different, since they may be willing to fund nonprofits in that type, okay, of situation. Any other comments or questions? While you're deciding whether you want to offer up any of those, on Monday, I'll be covering, okay, an article that appeared in Time, dealing with the small farming disaster, okay, in this country. It's quite a lengthy article. Will take some time to go through, but I'm going to cover that, okay, on Monday. Okay, and if I have time, I'm going to go through, okay, an article on the economic plans, okay, of labor. The economic plans of labor is outlined, okay, in the manifesto. Of course, have received lots and lots of criticism from people opposed to labor and from people on the right wing. And there's a defense in Jacobin given by, okay, a guy by the name of Medway, okay, James Medway. And James Medway is one of the economic He's an advisor to the Labour Party. He's not, okay, an MMTer, but he's considered to be very influential, okay, in the circles, okay, the Labour Party there. And he tries to answer the critique of the proposals that, okay, are made by the critics, okay, of the Labour Party. And I think in some ways he does a very good job. Okay, in other ways, I think he misses some opportunities. But uh, we'll go over his response to critiques, okay, of the manifesto. And I'll mention some of the implications for the possibility of a Green New Deal that Labour might enact, uh, hopefully in the UK. Okay, but I expect to do that for part of Monday. But okay, on Monday, the priority article, okay, I'm going to consider is the one from Time, and I'll comment on that and critique that and bring an MMT perspective to that and bring a Green New Deal perspective to it um, as well. I don't know why I'm frozen. You're seeing me lift my finger to my eye. I don't know why that has happened, and I don't know why, okay, it's frozen. As far as I can see in my camera, I'm not frozen. And in my XSplit monitor, I'm not frozen. Well, maybe I'm not really frozen. I may only be frozen in my Facebook view here. So, and Dolores Pierce says, thank you and good night. Thank you, Dolores. Ernest Jones has joined, and Lana says, thank you. Okay, and good night. Okay, since people are saying good night, and there are only 6 of you left, I think that I'm going to say good night, okay, as well. So thank you all for coming, and I will see you on Monday at around about 9 p.m. As well to discuss the crisis in the small farms and the critiques of the manifesto of the Labour Party, okay, in the UK. Have a great rest of weekend. I certainly will have a great time here myself. So, good night and good luck, as someone once said.